Alright, today I am getting ready to paint this fairy wren. So I'm just going to be using one brush, that's my water brush, and a palette of Cotman watercolors. I'm going to start by, as you can see, I am dipping the brush in water. You can do that or just squeeze it to get the water out. I'm going to start by wetting the painting, or the drawing, I should say, wetting the paper. So I'm going to start by doing the wet on wet technique, and that's one of my favorites to do. So I'm trying to just get inside some of these lines and wet certain areas of the bird. Avoiding the eye and some of the other parts. Getting some paint now on the brush. I'm getting this light blue color here. And just dropping it in to the water. And you can push it around to make sure it goes where you want it to go. And next I'm getting some of the darker blue. And I'm adding that to that next section. And hopefully, since it's wet on wet, the light blue and the dark blue will mix and look a little more seamless. And some more of that going on the chest area. So here I'm going to be mixing some of this even darker blue in here. Just dropping it in while it's still wet and kind of letting it do its thing. So wetting a little bit more of the bird now. Going down to his little tummy. Down the wing a little bit. So you can see there the wet parts because it's shiny. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. But that's what I have to do sometimes when I'm painting. I have to tilt it up a little bit to see which parts I have wetted already. I'm just trying to feather this out a little bit more now. Make him look a little scruffier. taking some of that blue there. Again, dropping it into the water. And just helping it move a little bit where I want it. So I'm mixing a little bit of the purple with a little bit of the blue. Dropping that in to create some darker places. Moving that out onto the wing now. Just picking up the paint that's already there and pulling it down with some water. Back to the lighter blue. And I love painting wet on wet and watching the way the paints mix together, watching how it acts in the water. Getting his little fluff around his legs. And just creating a little bit of a darker separation from that wing. Time for the tail. Here I'm doing the tail wet on dry, so I did not pre-wet the tail. I'm just taking that darker blue and just going down the tail with it. Just be careful if the wing is still wet and you do touch it with that paint, it will bleed together. If you're worried about that, you can wait until the wing part is completely dry. So going in with some of the lighter blue, trying to create some variation of color. I want some darker blue areas, some lighter blue areas. So Mixed a little bit of brown into my blues so that I'm getting a darker gray color now. Added some of that just onto the edge of the tail. And now adding some of that along the wing area and into the tummy to create those darker values. Putting some more blue on my palette, a little of the dark blue, a little of the light blue. Till I find a color I like. And I'm just going over those feather lines with a little bit of that. I'm not adding a ton of water to my paint, so my paint colors are a little more vibrant. If you want to make them lighter, you can always add more water. So I'm going in for some more brown. I just put that directly on the legs. As you can see, I had a little too much water, a little drip or something. I just wiped it off on my cup. It is always good to have a cup for dirty water and a cup for clean water. So you can rinse your brush in the dirty water and then pick up clean water to activate your paints and to put on your painting. A little bit of black mixed with my brown, and I'm just going along one edge of that leg there while the paint is still wet. Again, just to give it some darker value and to hopefully let that blend in with the lighter paint and make it look a little more organic. In there, I thought there was too much, so I wet my brush and I removed a little bit of that paint with a damp brush. You can always do that if you feel you have too much. You just get a clean, damp brush and pick up some of the paint. You don't want the brush sopping wet though, just damp. So after you put it in the water, you may want to pat it on a paper towel before trying that. And again there, I was not happy with the color, so I was picking up a little bit more of that paint. So I picked up some color, but just a little bit this time. Try and see if I can get that the way I want it. Now putting in some of that brown paint. adding a little bit of the black to the brown paint until I get a color I'm happy with, adding a little more there. So adding just the brown now, trying to create a shadow area underneath the bird with the darker paint. And be careful around the feet, especially if they are still wet. Taking a little bit more of that darker color and just adding in some detail there, a few lines to give the branch a little more depth. Some blue, some light blue, and some purple together. If you're unsure of your color mixing, you can always keep a piece of scrap paper around and test your colors there before putting it onto your painting. So down there by the eye, I should say up there. Just a little bit of that black there, adding into the color that I've already mixed. Just for kind of a gray-blue color, like a Payne's gray color, to add on to that wing. At this point, some of these areas should be dry before you go in with these, or else they will probably bleed too much. So you may want to wait until they are dry before going in and adding some of these details. You see I twisted around to do the beak, so the bottom of the beak I will do a little darker, and the top I will do a little lighter, as you will see here in a moment. My hand is a little bit in the way, but that's essentially the idea. So the way the bird is standing, you've got to think the sun is going to be reflecting off the top of the beak, so it's going to appear a little lighter. So first I just did it all in one color. So we'll let the beak dry before touching it again. And back to the feet, to the legs. A little touch of brown, just going over some of those colors that I already put on there. And see, I am looking to see what's dry, because you want the branch to be dry before going in with some of these things. You don't want your feet bleeding into your branch. And I did touch it to see if it's dry. That is not really the best way to see if it's dry. It's better to just look for a reflection on it, but sometimes I get impatient and I touch it, but you can mess your painting up by doing that. So just be aware of that. So I put a little bit of the darker color on the bottom of the beak. So I am putting now a little bit of this lighter blue color that I kind of mixed a little bit just over those lines and some of those areas in the wing. So at this point those lines would have been dry, and I'm just trying to soften everything out and add a little more depth of color. And I'm going over a few more of those details that got a little lost. Watercolor often dries lighter than when you put it on, so sometimes, well, most of the time, you do have to layer up with watercolor. So again, going in with some of that darker color that I had mixed and just adding some more of those details. And going in with a little bit of water and just trying to soften them a little bit. And since I was just working this area, this is a little bit wet, as you can see, because the colors are bleeding a little bit. As long as it's not too wet, they should just bleed a little and hopefully make it look like soft lines as opposed to hard lines, but not bleed too much. So got some black up here. And again, the reason I keep moving around is because before I add some of these details, I want to make sure that these spaces around these are dry. These are places where I don't want the paint to bleed together. And if it is wet and I touch it with some of this paint, then it will bleed. So I keep moving around because I'm letting some areas dry before I add more to those areas. Go back to the tail now, again, adding some darker parts in. Taking some black, putting it on my palette, letting it mix a little bit with some of my, just a little bit of my blue, and I'm going in to do my eye. So when I do the eyes, I try and make sure that I leave a shine in the eyes while I'm painting so the white of the paper is showing through. But sometimes I mess that up, so at that point I will go back in with white gouache to add them, but I do always try to make sure that I just leave the white of the paper shining through for those shines. So at this point, looking at my bird, deciding what he needs, deciding what I need to do next, checking how wet some of my areas are. You'll probably do a lot of this too, looking to decide if you're happy with what you've put down, if you need more of anything, if you need to change anything. So I'm getting some more of my light blue, watering it down some. And it did mix a little with some of my other colors, with some of my other blues on my palette, which is fine. Then I'm darkening up his little fluffy leg hairs. So I'm taking a little of my darker color I mixed earlier, adding a little black to it. When I first started putting it down, I decided it wasn't quite dark enough. Adding some brown, and going in to add a little bit of a darker shadow underneath my bird. And I'm just kind of letting that color feather out as I go there. So I decided to let my painting dry, and then when I come back, I am putting on some white gouache to add back in. Oh, I guess I didn't let him dry. I thought I had let him dry. And I'm going back in with some white gouache. I'm starting on the tail because the tail is dry. And adding in some highlights. But if you are not too impatient, you may want to let your bird dry before doing this step. But I am trying to put the gouache on the parts of my bird that I have already dried. And I'm just kind of using a stippling with the tip of the brush. Just kind of poking it poking it up and down on these areas, kind of a stippling effect. And then on the feet, of course, just doing lines to add a shadow. Not a complete line. I'm trying, if you can see, to have some spaces, some gaps in the line, so it doesn't look like just a line going up the bird, going up the tail, or going up the feet. So as you can see, as I'm tilting it, I am checking to see which parts are dry, so I know which parts I can work on. So here now, I am going back in. I believe now I have let the bird dry. So I'm going to those areas that were wet before. Now that they are dry, I'm adding some of the white gouache for some highlights in those areas. Now I'm going into my sparkly paint and just getting a little bit of it on my brush and adding a little bit of sparkle to this little guy. So the white gouache and everything else up on the head should be dry at this point, and I'm just going over and adding, again, kind of stippling on this sparkly paint. You can see it a little bit in the video there. It looks very beautiful in the light, in person. So really I'm just kind of deciding, I don't want to make the whole bird sparkly, but I just want to add a few areas that will pop a little bit, especially when the light hits it. So I'm just kind of going in and adding some of this in a few areas to give them just a little extra something. I'm not doing the whole tail, I'm just putting a few lines of this sparkly paint up the tail. And a few on the wings. Getting some of the darker highlight color that I had mixed before, and I'm just adding that underneath the wing to add a little more separation from the wing and the body. So this is like my darker gray color that I would have mixed up before. And that's it. This little fairy wren is done.